Okay, so welcome everyone to this very special session of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. Today, we are gathered here to commemorate the work of Professor Daniel Breazeale, who has recently passed away, leaving an enduring academic legacy. And the aim of the session is to reconstruct some aspects of this legacy. As you all know, Dan Breazeale's work was mostly focused on Fichte. He's one of the founders of the North American Fichte Society. He translated many of Fichte's most important books into English and has published several highly influential articles. He's also arguably responsible for turning many of the figures of the transition between Kant and Fichte known to Anglophone audiences, and thereby he arguably opened the doors for building bridges between researchers on different aspects of classical German philosophy. And we will discuss several of these topics today, guided by some of his academic peers who had the opportunity to share the path with him. Dan Breazeale was in Leuven in 2017 for a conference on Heinhold, and he was also a guest to this seminar, to the Leuven seminar, acting as a commentator to recent scholarship on Fichte. And he was always incredibly kind. I certainly did not know him as well as the guests we have here today, but I also had my share of moments with him, and I always had the impression that he had this incredible Fichten way of doing philosophy as a sort of performative practice to render us more autonomous. And but perhaps better than Fichte, he was incredibly kind and open. But let me introduce the speakers who will guide us through many of these different aspects of Dan's legacy. The first speaker of the day is Karl Ameriks. He's Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Notre Dame University. He has many influential publications on Kant, such as Kant and the Faith of Autonomy, published by Cambridge University Press in 2000, and more recently, Kantian Subjects, Critical Philosophy in Late Modernity, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Paul will give a talk on Dan's role in building bridges between Kant and Fichte scholars. So he will cover this aspect of Dan's legacy. The second speaker of the day will be John Walsh. He's research assistant at Martin Luther Universität in Halle-Wittenberg. He has several publications on these figures of transition between Kant and Fichte. I mentioned, for instance, Schmidt and the Doctrine of Intelligible Fatalism, published in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy in 2023, and The Fact of Freedom, Heinhold's Theory of Free Will Reconsidered, published in a collected volume on the concept of will in classical German philosophy. He will give a talk mostly focused on Heinhold and all these figures gravitating around Heinhold. So he will focus on Dan's legacy in this transition from Kant to Fichte. The third speaker of the day is Karin Liesenbaum. She's assistant professor at Syracuse University. She has also many influential publications, such as Fichte's Perfectionist Solution to the Problem of Kantian Autonomy, published in the Journal of the History of Philosophy in 2022, and more recently, the book For the Love of Metaphysics, Nihilism and the Conflict of Reason from Kant to Rosenzweig, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Karin will also focus on these figures of transition, but mostly on Maimon, on the notion of fictions, and she will engage also with Dan's legacy in turning some post-Fichtian figures more palatable, so to say, to Anglophone audiences. The fourth speaker of the day is Gabriel Gottlieb. Gabe is an associate professor of philosophy at Xavier University in Cincinnati, and he has also many publications. He's the editor of Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right, a critical guide, published by Cambridge University Press, and he also co-edited the volume Practical Philosophy Between Kant and Hegel, Freedom, Right, and Revolution, also published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Gabe is currently very, very active by the North American Fichte Society. He's organizing the next event in London coming up soon, and his talk will focus mostly on Dan's institutional legacy. As I mentioned, Dan co-founded the North American Fichte Society, and Gabe will guide us through this aspect of his legacy. The fifth and last speaker of the day is Professor Hal-Kyun. Hala is professor of philosophy at Sogang University in Seoul, South Korea. He has also several publications. He published, for instance, the chapter Abstraction on Fichte in a volume co-edited by Breazeale on Fichte and Transcendental Philosophy in 2014. And he also co-edited the volume Kant, Fichte, and the Legacy of Transcendental Idealism, published by Lexington Books in 2014. Hala will focus mostly on Dan's translations. Hala is active in South Korea, and I imagine that Dan's translations played a very important role in spreading Fichte's philosophy through different parts of the world, and Hala will focus mostly on this aspect of his legacy. So the structure is as follows. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to give his or her talk, followed by about 5 minutes for 1 or 2 questions after each talk. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A in which you can ask questions to all speakers, or even if you would like to, you can also share some of your thoughts and moments that you might have had with Dan. So after the session, we will leave open the Zoom meeting for further and more informal conversations. So it would be great if you could stay for this part as well. And without further ado, I give the floor to Karl Ameriks. Karl, thank you very much for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So as my ears are bothering me for some reason today. So if I'm not speaking clearly or I don't hear you, please say. So what I did is I wrote up some things. I wanted to make sure I wouldn't go over time. And so I've got some, general comments, mostly about Dan. So not going to give a typical philosophy paper, but I'll read those comments, and I really look forward to the discussion where we can get into issues. Before that, I'll ramble just a little bit. I don't want to lose track of the time, but just a couple of things. One is I'm really glad for all of us that Dan got his essays together in that book, the Wissenschaftslehre book. I mean, that was, he had so many writings all over, and I think it was really great for him and for all of us that he put those together and really worked on revised essays and so forth. So I won't talk about that directly, but it's, really is a major piece of scholarship in addition to everything else. Then there may be discussions of it. I was reading Wayne Martin's review some years ago. It's very interesting, and I recommend it to everybody. And it is bold of him to even put the word Wissenschaftslehrer in the title. So that was a great success. Philosophically, we, Dan, I think really agreed on practically everything except a couple of things on Kant. So I'll just mention those and then come up for discussion if people want to pursue it. But it's good to have some. It's terrible you meet people you just totally agree with everything, but it's good we had a few differences maybe that's encouraged some discussions. So two topics. One might keep in mind. One is, I'd say, epistemological. Dan, I think, was a friend of the Cartesian way, where you start with private representations and then build out. And I think he thought this was in Fichte and Kant as well. And my view would be it's in Fichte and Dan. But I proposed another way of looking at Kant. There are many who read Kant in this kind of Cartesian way, but I think a more profitable way in philosophy and Kant might be to start with a more public perspective where you have a lot of premises about at least some kinds of empirical knowledge, especially in the theoretical perspective. That's one issue. The other issue, of course, is freedom, and I'd say Dan's view is freedom first, and I'd agree with Kant and a lot of people. Freedom is the keystone concept, but where we might differ is whether or not it has theoretical presuppositions, because freedom isn't just agency or spontaneity, as these early German idealists think of it. It's supposed to be absolute, sort of uncaused causation, except for the agent itself. And Kant himself, when he first came upon the idea in the 1760s, I think it took him 20 years to work out how he was going to assert freedom in a publication. And maybe it's the case you have to do a lot more metaphysics first before you go to the primacy of practical reason. Anyway, those are just some issues. Oh, and then another thing, I was just looking over some of Dan's writings again this week, and every page you find, things you won't find anywhere else. So I noticed in Introduction to Nietzsche, he mentioned some essays that Nietzsche didn't get to finish for his untimely meditations. And the title of one is called How the Followers of a Genius Cancel His Effects. And I think that would have been a good essay. He probably had Wagner in mind, but it would be a good essay on German idealism or whatever. But we're here not to cancel effects, but to really magnify the effects of Dan and his work. So that's what I'll turn to now. That's enough rambling. Okay. It's a very special privilege to be part of this event, since, like everyone, I've always had an enormous admiration for Dan Breazeale as a person as well as a scholar. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from others today, for there's no way my brief remarks can do Dan justice. In our background and interests, we had a lot in common from the start, but although we had numerous happy and productive meetings at his school and mine, as well as at many large gatherings, I so wish there had been a chance to discuss all sorts of issues even further with him. I could tell that he and his family, like my own, maintained a deep interest in European culture in general, and I enjoyed hearing about how he developed close relationships with European scholars who have been essential to research in our field, such as Michael Gerten and Erich Fuchs at the Fichte Archive. It was only from a distance, however, that I admired his tireless activities in the North American Fichte Society and the International Fichte Society, where, as fate would have it, it turned out that despite the numerous lovely locations and tempting programs of the Fichtians, I was never able to make it to a meeting with him there, where I'm sure he always had a very special impact. And yet, despite my appearing as perhaps a Königsbergian interloper today, I've always had considerable interest in Fichte, and therefore, of course, in all of Dan's incomparable research in that specific area. Before I read Dan's work, however, my knowledge of Fichte came primarily from some courses in Germany, and my learning from Hegel scholars there about Fichte's pivotal role between Kant and Hegel, a role that at that time was rarely discussed in contemporary philosophy in English. In fact, one major reason why I accepted the opportunity years ago of becoming a co-editor of the Cambridge texts in the History of Philosophy series is that I truly believe that in that way I could at least help bring to the fore a couple masterpieces that, in my view, deserved immediate extra attention in English then, namely Nietzsche's early work and Fichte's practical philosophy. If only we really could get state-of-the-art introductions by the very best scholars. Dan played a special double role in the series, and I felt especially fortunate that he was willing to write an introduction, which is still essential reading, to Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations, as well as to take on the daunting task, along with Günter Zeller, of bringing out an up-to-date English edition of Fichte's Sittenlehre, which appeared as a companion to an edition of Fichte's equally important Naturrecht. My original admiration for Dan's work was actually not connected primarily with Fichte, but with his path-breaking 1982 article in Reinhold, which had a huge influence on my own research, as well as his 1990 volume of selections from Nietzsche on Truth, which I've always regarded as one of the most important books in English concerning Nietzsche. Okay, on that note, let me switch somewhat to comments more directly about Dan as a person. The very notion of the person is clearly central to both Dan's life and all his work, from his writings on the early Reinhold through all of Fichte and then Nietzsche as well. This was fitting, for clearly in the whole arc of post-Kantian philosophy, from Reinhold to Nietzsche, a central theme is understanding and promoting what is distinctive about the life of persons. And this often involves, as Dan pointed out, doing so in a way in which the personal style of the philosopher is reflected to a considerable degree within the philosopher's work. Dan's own philosophical style exhibited a complex quality that he generously appreciated in others, what he called a combination of passion as well as erudition. As you all know, Dan was an ideal philosopher to work with. He combined an engaging, open-minded spirit with expert knowledge and work habits that would satisfy even the most cantankerous Kantian. And one immediately sensed that he appreciated the limits as well as the rewards of the purely academic life. And this made him an enduring and as well as encouraging figure for anyone who knew him. I marveled at the calm strength he showed in reacting to the onset of serious illness years ago, and then the extra challenges they took on as a grandparent in helping with younger members of his family. Being an excellent teacher and scholar is a valuable thing, but being a constant, inspiring, and supportive source of strength, exhibiting true humanitate, is what made his presence as a person invaluable to all who knew him. All this fits in with the course of his career, his steady, unique path from the country's southern midsection to the halls of the East Coast and then back, with decades of service as a leader at the University of Kentucky. When he was a graduate student at Yale and I was an undergrad, there were several members of the Yale faculty who were quite familiar with the traditions of German philosophy. And this became a focus for many students. But even there, at that time, there was no wave of Fichte enthusiasm or publications on Nietzsche, let alone Reinhold. In fact, what occurred right then was a cosmic shift from the New Frontier, Happy Days, and Great Society projects of the 60s, which funded a considerable temporary expansion of philosophy departments in the US, to an early 70s wave of social political crises and cutbacks in education that suddenly made a career in philosophy look like a questionable choice even for top students at the best-known programs. What Yale students faced in particular was the surprising sudden realization that a specialization in German philosophy was by no means a matter of general interest in the rest of the country. Things have become difficult in our times as well, and in those days, as well as with many places now, once again, it was extremely difficult not only to get a philosophy job, but also to hold on to one. There is, for instance, someone who was one of the best teachers and philosophers I've known, and who was from a very good school and eventually had a highly successful career. And yet, in the early 70s, he was let go after 1 year at Kentucky. In fact, similarly, in the early 70s, lots of people were let go after about a year or so at Notre Dame when I arrived. So it definitely took great commitment for Dan to stay on his course and keep focused on what he did in German philosophy. I myself looked in other directions for a while then, and I don't know the story of how it was that he decided early on to write, of all things, about Reinhold and Anicedemus and then Fichte. Most people in the profession then surely would have had no thought that this would be a way to lay the foundation for a brilliantly successful career. But it turned out to be that, and so it goes with truly original and insightful work. Moreover, Dan, staying true to his early interests and fighting the good fight for decades by translating, editing, and commenting on texts that were far from the American canon, was crucial for creating the community of scholars that we are all a part of now, and that no one would have expected in the early 1970s. It is in part due to him that we now live in an era when even many of the top philosophy departments in the Anglophone world have at least someone who does important work in the post-Kantian field. So less sense in some, and in recollection of the first Fichte text I studied 55 years ago, The Vocation of the Scholar, it's our good fortune that we can celebrate the fact that Dan Breazeale was not only a leader in his profession, but also someone who always met in the best way the demanding calling of his vocation as a person. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Karl, for this touching talk. And if you have questions, we are now open. We would have time for 1 or 2 questions before moving on to the second speaker. So feel free to use the raise hand function in Zoom, or just make me a sign and I'll give you the word. Yes, Anthony.
Hi, Karl. Thanks for that. Good to see you. You mentioned, and I was aware of this, reflecting on Dan recently over the last couple months, that you overlapped at Yale. You mentioned that you were an undergrad and he was a grad student. What were your interactions like? Did you have any interactions? Did you look askance at this as you were budding Kantian?
It's great to know that maybe the family will be looking and seeing some of this. Actually, probably not, to be honest. So I was in graduate school very briefly, and I think I don't know exactly what he was doing when he was doing his dissertation. I don't recall directly. The interesting thing was his wife was a teacher of French, and my wife was teaching French and Spanish, and so we really meant to get together and do things. But it really didn't work out that way. So I don't have any specific references in New Haven. So we would talk about it and get together later. But it's still odd. There are people I should mention. Maybe you all know this. So Alan Wood was exactly 4 years ahead of me. So when I was an undergrad, he was a grad, and so when he finished up as grad student, I finished up as an undergrad. And David Hoy was in a similar situation. So David and Alan were the people 4 years ahead of me that I was very familiar with. And I think Dan was only 2 or 3 years ahead of me, but I think he was, probably just when I was doing intense things, he was probably doing his intense dissertation writing. And that would probably be the explanation. But even if I don't have recollection of conversations or even, questions at a meeting, because we had, among other things, we had tremendous visit with the department. Actually, was going downhill in all sorts of ways that we didn't realize. There were big crises after I left town. Not when I was there exactly. They'd had a big crisis because Sellers left just before I got there. But it was always calm when I was there. But the SPEP was founded when I was there, and there was a tremendous interest in German philosophy then. We had Herbert Marcuse and Hannah Arendt, and it was the 60s thing where everybody was doing philosophy, and even especially German philosophy. So maybe in a large crowd of hundreds of people, we were together, but I don't remember in smaller sessions, unfortunately. But there was that, there was an ethos. I mean, I think people really believed then that Charlie Reich's screening of America. He was in the law school. People would go to the law school and hear Charlie Reich do this thing. And it was a paperback, and it was a bestseller in the United States. And it was all about the Hegelian theory of consciousness. And this was kind of, if you lived in New Haven in those days, you just thought, well, it's kind of like being in Jena, you just have to talk about this stuff. And then, when we left the island, it was like leaving Tahiti and, having to survive in Antarctica or something like that. So that's why those who survived the frost of the 70s, like Dan, I do admire. We all had different accidental things, but Alan Wood was. I'd be curious. I wish Alan were here, because I'd be curious how Alan and connected, because Alan was doing Kant's philosophy of religion, and Dan certainly knew the Kritik aller Offenbarung. A lot of people were working on that connection between Kant and Fichte and philosophy of religion, especially at that time, and it's something you can work on for the rest of your life. So thanks for asking it. Sorry.
Great. Karen.
Thank you, Karl, for those comments. As I was preparing for this event, I reread Dan's review of your book, or response to your review, 3 Cheers for Post-Kantianism. And I'm curious whether you corresponded after that publication, and whether Dan had, an impact in your thinking about the role of the primacy of the practical in post-Kantian philosophy.
Well, we went on quite a bit on, I wrote a reply, and then he continued to think about it. And that's why I was interested in the Wissenschaftslehre book, where he, continued to discuss the issue. I don't think, we convinced each other, but I think there are ways I could go on and explain, why I still think, there's a difference between us, because I think, just one example, if you look at the footnote in the Wissenschaftslehre book, he, one of the first footnotes and last essay, he says, well, Fichte really was a Kantian because he was so enthused when he first read Kant, and so it wasn't really so mediated by Reinhold and so forth. And I understand what's going on there, but the point is, my view was that Fichte read the second critique, and then he read Reinhold, and Reinhold had the Vorstellungsvermögen, so he had this general philosophy. And that was really when Fichte had this, really get his, not his practical philosophy, but get his system going. I would say, the fact that Fichte skipped the first critique in his first reading of Kant, and then went to Reinhold, explains a lot about why there's not the discussion that a lot of us would welcome of more of the metaphysics of the first critique. But there are different ways to go on that issue. And I always thought it was very interesting that it was great that people keep on working at Fichte, because although technically you might hold the view, which I still hold, that absolute freedom really needs a metaphysical discussion first, because it's not just a simple thing like action, or I feel like I'm an agent or something. That doesn't do it. Although that may be true, at the same time, I felt equally that always felt that it's such a mysterious issue that when you get into the practical realm of real questions, and how to react to the French Revolution, or are you going to organize society? You can leave the metaphysics behind, doing all these specific arguments. And in that realm, it's fantastic how I think Kant and Fichte and Hegel, they all kind of dovetail, because they're all really talking about interpersonal, mutual recognition, but they fill it out in very different ways, and they're all helpful. So, there's a sense in which it was more a philosopher's question, foundations, where Dan and I would, I think, disagree. But, I think we all agreed in going to Paris as often as we could, and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Louise, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. So thank you so much, Karl, for this very stimulating first talk. It was really nice. And we will move on to our second speaker of the day. And if you had questions to Karl Ameriks, we'll have time for the questions in the Q&A. So we move on to John Walsh, who will give a talk on the figures of transition from Kant to Fichte, especially Reinhold and all the other philosophers gravitating around Reinhold. So John, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And beforehand, if I might briefly follow up on some of that discussion, Dan had told me a story where he had written his dissertation at Yale on Hume and Nietzsche and the problem of knowledge. And he had been taking a course on Kant with a professor who got kind of caught up in the 60s counterculture and with some psychedelic substances and more or less stopped showing up to teach the class. And so Alan Wood actually ended up teaching the class that Dan was taking on Kant at the time.
Wasn't me.
So I have a PowerPoint that I'll share. So it's an honor to speak to Dan's work and legacy on figures between Kant and Fichte, and I thank Karin, Luis, Manuel, and Pier Paolo for inviting me to do so. I'm going to focus on Dan's work on Karl Reinhold, since this was a major interest of Dan's, and he made a significant contribution to Reinhold scholarship. And I'll do so by giving just an overview of Dan's work on this topic to give an impression of the breadth of his work. Reinhold was an important figure to Fichte's development of the Wissenschaftslehre, of course, and it's undoubtedly because of this connection that Dan came upon Reinhold. However, his interest in Reinhold was not passing, occupying his attention for 4 decades. His first paper on Reinhold is Between Kant and Fichte, Karl Leonhard Reinhold's Elementary Philosophy, published in Review of Metaphysics in 1982. And note that Dan's first article ever was on Nietzsche in 1975, so just 7 years prior. And his first article on Fichte was in 1981. And this article on Fichte, Fichte's Anaxidemus Review and the Transformation of German Idealism, also discusses Reinhold at length in relation to Fichte. So Dan's publications on Reinhold go back as far as those on Fichte. And to my knowledge, Dan's first paper on Reinhold was the first in-depth study of Reinhold in English. And admirably, Dan not only presents the elementary philosophy as a key to understanding the development of German idealism, he argues in the conclusion, or at least suggests, its systematic importance to philosophy more generally. His next publication on Reinhold came some years later, in 1998, where he investigates Reinhold's position on the relationship between skepticism and transcendental idealism. And this was followed in 2003 with 2 Cheers for Post-Kantianism, in which he challenges Karl Ameriks' interpretation of Kant and the post-Kantian project as undertaken by Reinhold and Fichte. Along with Karl and many other scholars, some of whom are here, Martin Bondeli, Faustino Fabianelli, Michael Gerten, Yves Retrizzani, Sylvan Imhoff, Marco Ivaldo, Dan was an active participant in the international Reinhold conferences, around which Reinhold scholarship revolved since 1998. The first of these conferences took place from the 14th to the 18th of March, 1998 in Bad Homburg, where Dan presented and then published on Reinhold's and Maimon's views on the use of fictions in philosophy. Unable to attend the second conference held in Lucerne in 2002, Dan presented on the methodological role of intellectual intuition in the first iteration of Reinhold's elementary philosophy at the Third International Reinhold Conference in Rome in October 2004. Besides the German translation of his 1982 paper, published in the edited volume Am Rande des Idealismus, Dan's next publication on Reinhold arose in connection with the Fourth International Reinhold Conference held in Montreal, Canada in 2007, where he examined Reinhold's appropriation of Kant's notion of the needs of reason against the backdrop of the pantheism controversy. In the proceedings of the following International Reinhold Conference, held in Siegen in 2010, Dan defended Reinhold's account of free will. This is particularly important piece of scholarship, not only because of the cogency of Dan's interpretation, but also because of his engagement with Reinhold scholarship. And to understand the significance of this, it's helpful to mention that in some areas of Reinhold's thought, and especially in past scholarship, but to some extent even today, the work on Reinhold and the scholarship is still nascent. And so many of these Reinhold conferences would focus on a particular phase of Reinhold's thought. For example, the conference in Kiel in 2017 was devoted to Reinhold's phase of rational realism, and the most recent conference in 2022 in Parma was focused on Reinhold's philosophy of language. And so a lot of the work in these conferences and the scholarship on Reinhold is really groundbreaking, and just trying to get a sense of Reinhold's work and his thought. Also, the collected edition of Reinhold's works, Karl Leonhard Reinhold Gesammelte Schriften, is still underway, as is the Korrespondenzausgabe, and the international, So Dan's paper on Reinhold's account of free will is interesting because it critically engages not only with Reinhold's contemporaries and their criticisms of Reinhold's account of free will, for example, Fichte, but Dan's paper also engages with papers and scholars which had been published in the previous decade. And so Dan's paper marks an important development in work on Reinhold, in which a sufficient foundation of scholarship had been laid that enabled a critical engagement with views on Reinhold within Reinhold scholarship itself. Another paper I'd like to draw attention to is Reinhold Schulze Fichte, a re-examination. In this paper, Dan treats the relationship between Reinhold Gottlieb Ernst Schulze, who published the infamous Ennis Edimus, and Fichte, who reviewed the latter. And you may recall Dan's first article on Fichte was on this topic in 1981. In this 2016 paper, Dan engages with numerous scholars over the past 3 decades by taking up his starting point as a scholar of Reinhold and Fichte and re-examining the issues in light of recent work. I think this speaks volumes about Dan, not only as a scholar, but as a person, insofar as it indicates his tireless pursuit of truth, unabashed to return to already trodden ground to see what still might be uncovered. Dan's scholarship on Reinhold continued into more recent years. In Wie der Blinde von der Farbe, Reinhold's Misappropriation of the Wissenschaftslehre, a narrative published in 2020, Dan examines Reinhold's loosely called Fichte phase, arguing that Reinhold fundamentally misunderstood the Wissenschaftslehre. And in Freedom and Duty, Kant Reinhold Fichte, published in an edited volume in 2021, edited by James Clark and Gabe Gottlieb, Dan investigates the constellation of issues surrounding freedom and imputability in Kant, Karl Christian Erhard Schmid, Reinhold, and Fichte. And even in his most recent work, devoted more to Fichte, he also makes numerous allusions to Reinhold, including in Fichte in the Path from Formal to Material Freedom, published in a volume edited by Stefano Bachin and Owen Ware, and in Construction and Intuition, the Method of the Wissenschaftslehre, which was a paper draft, which is unpublished, and which he presented in Vienna in 2022 and online at a conference in Munich in 2022, which was organized by Luis. Of course, Dan's work on figures between Kant and Fichte was not limited to Reinhold. In several papers already mentioned, he engaged with Maimon as well, and other minor figures I've mentioned like Schmid and Ulrich. In 2018, Dan published a paper exclusively on Maimon in European Journal of Philosophy, Philosophy in the Method of Fictions, Maimon's Proposal and its Critics. Dan's translation work also contributed to making debate in the immediate reception of Kant's philosophy accessible to an Anglophone audience. And here I have in mind his translations of Fichte's reviews of Leonhard Kreuzer's Skeptical Reflections on Freedom of the Will and of Friedrich Heinrich Gebhardt's On Ethical Goodness, text significant to the discourse on the intersection of freedom and morality held by Kant, Ulrich, Schmid, Reinhold, Kreutzer, and Fichte. And these translations also, as you can tell by the title, that they're annotated. They can contain lots of footnotes, and Dan even translates parts of Fichte's Nachlass and his notes that he took in preparing the reviews, and gives his own insight into the relationship between the reviews and Fichte's further development. And so they're a very valuable piece of scholarship. Furthermore, Dan authored numerous encyclopedia articles on figures between Kant and Fichte, including the article on Reinhold in the Dictionary of 18th Century Philosophers, edited by Heiner Klemme and Manfred Kuhn, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the latter of which was expanded and republished in 2021 as co-authored by Dan and I, as well as articles on Fichte, Hölderlin, Jacobi, Reinhold, Schelling, and Schiller in the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy. Dan's advancement of scholarship on figures between Kant and Fichte extended beyond his own writings and included his service to the profession. He was a member of the editorial board of the new critical edition of the works of Salomon Maimon, published by Frohman Holzbug, and a founding member of the editorial board of the Reinholdiana series, published by de Gruyter. He also reviewed works in the Reinhold Korrespondenzausgabe and the edition of Reinhold's Gesammelte Schriften, along with numerous books and translations on German philosophy between Kant and Fichte. Dan's teaching also included courses on this period, such as Philosophy as Art from Kant to Schelling, Schlegel, and Novalis, Problems of Transcendental Method from Kant to Fichte, and In Search of a Concrete Ethics from Kant to Hegel. An erudite scholar, acute thinker, an exceptional person, Dan touched the hearts and minds of scores of students and colleagues, and he will surely be missed by those who knew him and his legacy admired by those who did not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this wonderful talk. So the floor now is open for one or two questions. Please just feel free to use the raise hand function or just tell me if you want to ask a question. Anthony.
Thanks, John, for that. Obviously, you spent time with Dan over sort of recent years, working with him. Do you have a sense of how much time he spent with early career scholars, graduate students, helping them either to gain some kind of prominence, maybe work with him on certain projects? I can speak for myself and probably many others on the call now that he was really helpful and supportive, certainly for myself at various stages of my career. But I'm wondering if you are aware of either through anecdotes or friends in common in the field, what sort of younger folks he would have been either giving attention to or bringing into the scholarly fold.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, my perspective is somewhat limited, I suppose. I'm not sure what other scholars he was working with. He definitely was very influential for my development and supported me at great length. I know that he also interacted with Owen Ware and corresponded with Owen. I think he also gave a talk in Toronto, and he was invited to contribute to that volume edited by Stefano Bacin and Owen. So I know that he was involved with Owen and Owen's work on Fichte scholarship, but I'm not intimately familiar with other cases, so sorry that my answer is unfortunately a little limited.
Okay. So
it seems like Carl has a question.
I'm so sorry. I haven't seen it. Yeah, Carl, please.
It's not just a little extra on the students. So I just want to mention there was a student from Dan's that we thought very highly of, came to Notre Dame, did a very good dissertation. And I wish he were here. He said he just couldn't make it. A very good fellow. And he wrote a dissertation on Nietzsche, not on Fichte, but he also co-wrote a book on novelist Marilyn Robinson. I just want to mention that those kind of interests, it was like, just having, almost like having Dan around, because it was someone who had really deep interest in philosophy in general and German philosophy. So just supplement that. Thank you.
Nice. So if there are no further questions or comments, thank you so much, John, for your talk. And if you have further questions for John, we'll have time at the end. We'll move on now to our third speaker of the day, Karin Nissenbaum. She just posted the handout of her talk on the chat, so it should be available to all of you. And Karin, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Karin will talk about Dan's role in also in turning these figures between Kant and Fichte more known to Anglophone audiences, and she will focus mostly on mime and the method of fictions. Karin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you, Karin, for the invitation. I also feel very honored and humbled to be here. Although I only met Dan once in my life in person, he had an enormous impact on my thought. So as Luis mentioned, there's a handout just with a few quotations and papers that I'll refer to. The question before us is precisely how and in what sense can an enterprise as abstract and esoteric as a systematic deduction of the transcendental foundations of human experience be said to produce harmony between one's head and one's heart? To this question, Fichte's remarks seem to imply the following answer. Philosophy cannot actually overcome the divisions within the I. Instead, what it can do is to make sense of the division in question by showing it to be absolutely necessary for the possibility of any experience whatsoever. Philosophy cannot make us whole. It cannot unite Faust's two souls. It cannot remove entirely the conflict between one's head and heart. For if it were actually to achieve any of these things, it would at the same time have abolished the fundamental condition for the very possibility of experience, freedom, cognition, and self-consciousness. These words sum up Dan Breazeale's view that Fichte's philosophical system is held together by his deep concern with the integration or unity of the rational and natural aspects of human nature. In his lectures concerning the scholar's vocation, Fichte argues that the highest good is a complete harmony of a rational being with himself. I met Dan Breazeale only once at a conference I organized in 2015 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on the topic of transcendental arguments, practical postulates, and philosophical fictions. Looking back at our interactions in the seminar room overlooking the Judean desert, it strikes me how Dan embodied Fichte's ideal of harmony between the rational and natural aspects of human nature. Like Fichte's ideal scholar, Dan not only dedicated his life to the acquisition of knowledge and to sharing this knowledge with others, he also valued knowledge for its vital contribution to the advancement of mankind, and his example inspired his students and colleagues to approximate the ideal of harmony between head and heart. My comments on Breazeale's scholarship will focus on his groundbreaking work on post-Kantian debates concerning the use of fictions in philosophy. One feature of Breazeale's work on Kant and the German idealist tradition is an ongoing inquiry into the tasks, character, and method of transcendental philosophy. As part of this project, in the last 2 decades of his life, Breazeale published a series of essays that examine Solomon Maimon's and Fichte's provocative remarks concerning the legitimate employment within philosophy of the method of fictions. As I will explain, what is ultimately at issue in this debate is the epistemic and ontological status of philosophical principles and explanations. Maimon first developed his account of fictions in 1791 in the entry on fiction or fabrication in his philosophical dictionary. He there defines a fiction or fabrication in the most general sense as an operation of the power of imagination, by means of which there is produced in the manifold of an object a unity that is not objectively necessary. It is often in the context of discussions of mathematics, physics, and other natural sciences that Maimon considers the method of fictions. For example, he examines how such basic concepts of Newtonian mechanics as absolute empty space and absolute time are, objectively speaking, neither true nor false, but justified by their utility and fruitfulness. That is, by the fact that they facilitate the discovery of new truths that can then be independently verified. Yet, on Breazeale's view, Maimon recognizes a crucial difference between the method of fictions as employed in philosophy and the same method as it is employed in mathematics or physics. Breazeale writes, Whereas the latter employment is supposed to lead to the discovery of new, objectively real truths, even though the fictional concepts that permit such discoveries are themselves neither true nor false, the use of fictions in philosophy can never produce nor lead to the discovery of any new truths whatsoever, whether about things in themselves or about our own subjective mental constitution. So, in the case of philosophy, the use of fictions is limited to producing systematic unity among our various knowledge claims and among the various sciences with which we possess an extra-philosophical acquaintance. As Breazeale explains, Maimon's views concerning the use of fictions in philosophy are intimately connected with his views concerning the nature of philosophy. On Maimon's view, the task of philosophy is not to produce new cognitions or to establish new material truths about objects. Instead, its task is to unify the cognitions we already possess. Philosophy is thus a purely formal science, and philosophical knowledge is not real cognition at all, and neither the first principles nor the conclusions of philosophy need make any claim to the kind of objective truth claimed by mathematics and by empirical science. This doesn't mean that there is no criterion for evaluating a proposed fictional philosophical principle as the indispensable ground of philosophical knowledge. One can assess the success or suitability of the proposed fictional first principle in terms of the degree to which it facilitates systematic unity. Yet, as Breazeale explains, these higher-order philosophical claims must always remain purely hypothetical. What one knows in such a case is that if we posit certain fictional principles, then we can impose upon our experience a certain degree of systematic unity. On Maimon's view, no degree of success can transform such a principle into a real metaphysical truth, and there's no reason to think that there's one and only one best principle of philosophy, or just one set of unifying principles. I turn now to Fichte's views concerning the fictional character of philosophical first principles and the use within philosophy of the method of fictions. Breazeale was among the first scholars to emphasize the significance of striking passages from Fichte's published and unpublished writings, in which he asserts that some of his core philosophical concepts and principles are fictional. For example, in his Foundations of Natural Right, Fichte describes the idea of an original right, a right individuals possess outside of any real or imagined community, as a mere fiction, but one that must necessarily be created for the sake of a science of right. And in his unpublished Meditations on an Elementary Philosophy, Fichte suggests that the explanatory concept of the original striving of the I, with which the foundations of the science of knowledge will later begin, is a fiction. Breazeale rightly notes that there are many advantages to a fictionalist interpretation of the Jener Wissenschaftslehre. This interpretation, for example, makes sense of Fichte's frequently repeated claim that the first principle of his system, the absolute I, never occurs within consciousness, except as freely posited by the philosopher for the purpose of constructing his system. And it is consistent with Fichte's assertions concerning the hypothetical character of all purely philosophical concepts and principles. Yet Breazeale also argued that there seems to be a tension between this fictionalist reading of the Jener Wissenschaftslehre and Fichte's forceful insistence on the reality of his system and its first principle. In a passage from a comparison between Professor Schmid's system and the Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte asserts that the science of knowledge is a thoroughly real philosophy, in which by its very nature there's no room whatsoever for any free imaginative fabrication. The fictionalist reading of the Wissenschaftslehre also seems incompatible with Fichte's claim that there can be only one true philosophy. As Breazeale explains, this is because there appears to be no good reason to believe that the formal unity demanded by the method of fictions is achievable in only one way, or that there's one and only one fictional first principle that might be suitable for establishing the kind of systematic unity aimed at within philosophy. As I mentioned earlier, what is at issue in this post-Kantian debate concerning the use of fictions in philosophy is the epistemic and ontological status of philosophical principles and explanations. The question Breazeale raises is how Fichte's qualified recognition of the fictional character of any philosophical explanation can be reconciled with his unqualified insistence upon the reality of his own philosophy. Breazeale's answer to this question appeals to Fichte's insistence upon the ultimately practical foundation of all belief, and to Kant's postulates of practical reason and his doctrine of rational belief. For Kant, rational belief is characterized by a firm assent, holding to be true, that is based on subjective grounds, even while the subject is aware that she does not have objective or evidential grounds. For example, in the case of rational moral belief, a subject can legitimately form a belief that P, if and only if P is a logically possible proposition for or against which the subject cannot have epistemically sufficient grounds in the form of proof or evidence, and if and only if the subject has an absolutely necessary moral end, and a necessary condition of attaining this end is having a firm assent that P. Taking Breazeale's cue, let us apply this framework to Fichte's views concerning the epistemic and ontological status of philosophical principles and explanations. We have seen that Fichte agrees with Maimon that philosophy has as its necessary end producing systematic unity among our various knowledge claims. If a necessary condition of attaining this end is firmly assenting to the reality of Fichte's first principle, the absolute I, then one can legitimately assent to the reality of this principle, even while being aware that one does not have sufficient objective or evidential grounds for this belief. If one understands the manner in which the first principle is inseparably connected to reason's interest in systematicity, one's affirmation of this principle can be described as a pure rational belief. I take it that this is how Breazeale's proposed solution to the tension between fictionalist and realist readings of Fichte's system and its first principle should be understood. I also take it that this is how the idea that philosophy as a whole should have the form of a system of ideas or practical postulates should be understood. This view is expressed most emphatically in the earliest system program of German idealism, a fragment that has been attributed to Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling, and it is also a view that both Fichte and Schelling repeatedly express when they assert that the first principle of their system has a status of a postulate. Breazeale's interpretation of and contribution to the post-Kantian debate concerning the use of fictions in philosophy underscored the role of fundamental commitments in philosophy, thereby emphasizing the continuity between philosophy and life, between abstract philosophical problems and existential concerns. Although I don't have time to go into this now, I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A period about the role that I see philosophical fictions still play in contemporary philosophical debates, for example, in contemporary discussions on the relationship between dignity and human rights, or on contemporary discussions on the way that we should interpret the value of humanity in Kant's philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this very stimulating talk. And the floor is now open for questions. Yeah, Karl.
Oh, Karl, I think you're muted.
There we go. I don't know how that. Sorry, I got so excited. I thought the main point of your talk we could talk about a lot. I'm interested in fictions and unity. Uniqueness and completeness of systems, but I have to just pick up on the last thing because I'm interested in how you apply that to the concept of dignity. Actually, I have a book coming out this year on Kant and dignity. So what are you saying about dignity in fictions?
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to. I look forward to reading your book, Karl. I'm teaching a grad seminar now on human dignity, and one thing that really struck me when I was looking at Jeremy Waldron's really, very influential account of how we should understand the relationship between dignity and rights, and how dignity should be understood as a foundation for rights. He doesn't use the word fiction, but he says that we can think of the concept of dignity as something like a organizing concept, that even if we don't think that that enables us to sort of ground our claims concerning human rights and the unity of those human rights, but that the status of the idea of dignity is, again, something that just has this kind of functional, useful role of organizing our commitments to certain rights. So I see that as playing a very similar role to the role that Fichte and Maimon think philosophical fictions play in systematizing our thought. So I'm happy to talk about that with you. I'm very excited to be writing a book on dignity.
You have a follow-up, Karl. Go ahead.
We'll go on. We'll have a big, long discussion on this, I hope, soon. I'll just mention Waldron is a lawyer, a great lawyer. And so it makes sense that he's in that domain. But I'll just mention the hypothesis. I think in Fichte probably, but certainly in Kant, I would hold it's dignity, unlike some of the other things, could be argued to be much more than a fiction. It's something that's like a phenomenal. But that's, you know, when you get into these other discussions with other people, they back off of that, lawyers and philosophers of law and so forth. But so it's fascinating. I'm so glad you're working on this. Thank you.
Right. I'm not, you know, my claim is not that for Fichte or Kant, dignity has a status of a fiction, but just that it seems like people who are now writing about the sense in which dignity might be a foundation for human rights do seem to think of it as playing the role of something like a philosophical fiction.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, we'll have enough time during the Q&A. Thank you so much, Karin. And we'll now move on to our fourth speaker of the day, Gabriel Gottlieb, who will talk about Dan's the institutional aspect of Dan's legacy. So thank you so much, Gabe, for accepting the invitation, and please, the floor is yours.
Great, and thank you, and thanks for organizing this and for hosting us. So I'm just going to read some comments I put together, mostly on the North American Fichte Society. So Dan Breazeale founded the North American Fichte Society in 1991 with Tom Rockmore. They were, as Dan liked to note, the Society's co-positors. Since its inception, the North American Fichte Society, or NAFS, has been dedicated to hosting biennial conferences on Fichte's philosophy and the publishing of those proceedings. The first conference was held in spring of 1991, and its proceedings were published as Fichte Historical Context / Contemporary Controversies in 1994 with Humanity Press. In 1993, Dan began publishing Fichteana, an occasional newsletter of the North American Fichte Society, which included news, conferences, notices, lists of new publications, and information about other Fichte societies around the globe. Under Dan and Tom's leadership, NAFS hosted 14 conferences and published something like 13 proceedings. In 2019, Ben Crow and I took over the North American Fichte Society, becoming its second set of co-positors. And we just published the 14th set of proceedings, Fichte's 1804 Wissenschaftslehre, Essays on the Science of Knowing, in February 2024 with SUNY Press. In 2021, David Wood took over Fichteana as editor and Keen Hao Gao as associate editor. They wisely expanded Fichteana by adding an advisory board and transforming an advisory board and book reviews of published works in English and in other languages. Their efforts have thereby transformed Fichteana from a newsletter into a review of Fichte research. The first volume, issue 22, was published last year, and the newest volume, issue 23, was recently published and includes numerous remembrances from Dan's friends and colleagues from all over the world. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, you can Google Fichteana, and I guarantee that will be the only thing that comes up. And you can read volume 23, which has some really beautiful remembrances, some by folks here on the call. I want to say a few things about the nature of the North American Fichte Society and how I think its spirit has been shaped by Dan. I think that what stands out most about conferences is that they are egalitarian. When Ben Crow and I took over, Dan was adamant about this aspect of the society. There are no keynotes. Everyone gets 30 minutes to present with 30-minute Q&A. Most submissions are accepted, and most papers are published in the proceedings. NAFS aims to be open and welcoming. As NAFS And the conferences have grown due largely to the growth of interest in Fichte's philosophy in the Anglo-American world, which is due largely to Dan's scholarship and translations. The conferences have grown in size. The next NAFS conference, which is in June 15th to 17th at the University of College London, will be the biggest by far, with roughly 45 presenters. Now, maybe the conferences hit that number in their first day, but for Fichte scholarship, this is quite a big event for us. I remember attending my first NAFS meeting at DePaul in 2008, and while I welcomed the egalitarian spirit of the conference, it also meant that Dan and Tom, including all the other presenters, were there for my paper. The conference was on Fichte's system of ethics, which at the time, I can safely say now, was, in 2008, a book I barely understood. Dan was gracious, chatted with me about the paper afterwards, and made me feel welcomed. Dan invited me to publish the paper in the conference proceedings, but I wisely decided not to. I deleted every trace of the paper for posterity's sake. This leads me to say something about Dan's scholarship, which largely took the form of translations and interpretive essays. When Dan was translating Fichte's Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre, he told me that one reason he was doing the translation, despite the need for an accurate version of the text in English, is that he felt he could never really understand that text unless he translated it. In a sense, for him, the task of translation was personal. It was to understand the material, to, if you will, bring it into harmony with himself. With Fichte, and honestly any great figure, this is an infinite task. Dan's desire to understand is what I think made his scholarship so valuable to students and to other scholars. In the preface to his book, Thinking Through the Wissenschaftslehre, Oxford 2013, he writes, "It has been my goal to provide students of Fichte with something of a guide to the perplexed," calling to mind Maimonides, a goal for which I consider myself unusually well qualified, inasmuch as all my own research in this area has been inspired and driven by my own genuine perplexities concerning the aims, methods, and teaching of the Wissenschaftslehre. There are few works, I think, in the history of philosophy as perplexing as Fichte's Grundlage. Dan's work aimed to unpack, disentangle, distinguish, and specify the function of key concepts and ideas, including terms such as Anstoß, intellectual intuition, or phrases like the pragmatic history of the mind. In 2015, I published a review of Dan's Thinking Through the Wissenschaftslehre in the journal Mind. And Mind does something unique with their reviews. They send the review to the author prior to its publication. In my review, I wrote about the book. I said, it's incredibly rich with interpretive detail, historical context, and engagement with the scholarship. At times, I find myself wanting more of a critical engagement with Fichte's actual arguments, first by reconstructing them, and second by assessing their strengths and weaknesses as arguments. Thinking through the Wissenschaftslehre is achieved by working out conceptual and textual ambiguities, but it is also done by carefully determining the nature and plausibility of Fichte's arguments. So in some way, I was wanting something to be more reconstructive of the actual arguments and to dig into the nature of those arguments. I no longer have Dan's response to the review, but what I do remember is that he only responded to this minor criticism, and it was with a matter of fact, "That's not what I do." I actually found his response quite clarifying, as it helped adumbrate the scope and purpose of his scholarship. It also, at least for me, made it clear that there's an important direction in which Fichte scholarship must go. I think someone who exemplifies this kind of direction is the work of Michel Koch, who is very much invested in a kind of reconstructive assessment of certain arguments within the text. Dan's scholarly orientation has meant that he is less inclined to enter into debate, though he makes exceptions for Karl, to enter into debate with other scholars and to criticize views of others. So Dan's not necessarily that kind of scholar. Scholarly debate is often productive, though, and clarifying, yet it can also issue in Ptolemaic epicycles with diminishing returns. I don't mean to suggest that Dan did not critically engage the work of fellow scholars. In fact, when he updated the his essays for the 2013 volume, he really packs the footnotes with recent literature. But when he did engage, it was always productive and clarifying. One such exchange that comes to mind in this respect is his exchange with Tom Rockmore concerning whether Fichte is an epistemic foundationalist, as Dan held, or an anti-foundationalist, as Rockmore insisted. It seems to me that Dan's approach to scholarship has had a significant impact on NAF's and Anglo-American Fichte scholarship. NAF's conferences have largely been organized thematically: Fichte and phenomenology, Fichte's practical philosophy, or by focusing on a singular text, such as the System of Ethics, the Addresses, or the Vocation of Man. The conferences have not been organized, for instance, around philosophical problems, for example, Fichte and the mind-body problem, or current academic trends, maybe recognition or grounding. I think it is fair to say that the conferences and their proceedings have to a large extent followed Dan's approach. They have been focused on understanding, the kind of understanding Dan himself aimed to achieve. This approach has made the many volumes edited by Dan and Tom essential reading for students and scholars attempting to find their footing. And many of the essays in these volumes have themselves become classics within the literature on Fichte. As it turns out, many of those classics are by Dan himself. Dan's approach has, I think, made the community of Fichte scholars a welcoming one and has served as a model for many of us. His work has laid a foundation that, to my mind, will allow many of us to carry out the kind of productive debates needed to further clarify Fichte's philosophy. However, we must be careful not to get lost in the production of one epicycle after another. We can leave that to the Kantians. Thanks.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Gabe. Questions? I see Anthony has a question.
Hi, thanks for this, Gabe. You mentioned that, of course, Dan prefaces his 2013 book as a kind of guide to the perplexed, of whom he counts himself. I'm wondering if you think that Dan saw there to be a difference between guiding perplexed thinkers and providing what you were describing as rational reconstructions of arguments. And I would actually want to extend that question to you. Do you see a difference between guiding us through perplexity and providing rational reconstructions, or whether or not there's maybe more compatibility between the two, maybe in your view, than perhaps Dan himself saw, if that's the case?
Yeah. No, I think there is a lot of compatibility between those two views. But I think that was not Dan's interest or strength, maybe. That is, and some of his early scholarship is really, really great because he digs into the letters and he finds these nuggets that help unpack the text. And that's a real task and requires a set of skills that not all of us necessarily have. And I think that was really one of his strengths in doing that kind of historical and reconstructive work in that way. But in some ways, I think that kind of more rational reconstruction approach was not the way he did the history of philosophy. I don't think he thought negatively about that. at all, but that's just not the way he kind of did it. And that's what I actually found clarifying in this exchange, because in part, in some ways that wasn't clear to me as something that Dan wasn't engaged in as much until reading through that book really carefully and having that exchange. But yeah, I don't see any reason why those are incompatible methods. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabe. More questions. We would have time for one more. I
mean, I would just add, if I can.
Go ahead.
Sorry, that I mean, Gabe just mentioned, Dan's, proclivity and sort of excitement in digging into the letters and digging into minutia of correspondence, things that are not only untranslated but overlooked even by specialists like us. And I recall just the day before I found out that Dan had passed away, I posted on social media a very sort of in the weeds footnote that Dan had about how a paper that Fichte had submitted to Schiller's journal had been rejected, and the rejection notice that he received from Schiller and how disappointed it was to Fichte. And of course, Dan had to complete it by informing the reader that Fichte just turned it around and published it in his own journal. These kinds of things, give life and obviously some levity and humor to the details that we're always bogged down in as historians of philosophy, I would say.
Great. Do you want to say something about this, Gabe?
No.
No. Okay. So thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And if you have more questions to Gabe, we'll have time at the end. We will move on now to our last speaker of the day, Hal-Kyun Kim, who will talk about Dan's translations worldwide, especially in South Korea, where Hala works. Hala, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Luis and Corinne, for organizing this wonderful conference, and also for the invitation. I'll simply read the brief draft that I wrote, and it's entitled Breazeale, Russell and the Robust Sense of Reality in Fichte. In South Korea, Fichte is known for having held that human life is a struggle between the I and the not I. This phrase has been taken from a book by a well-known Korean historian and historiographer in the early 20th century. Since this is a part of the high school history textbook now, just about every student in Korea knows about the I and the not I and their struggle with each other. According to this official view, history is a stage where the I and the not I struggle with each other. And we can trace this remark to Fichte's Vocation of the Scholar of 1794. In this work, Fichte makes it abundantly clear that the vocation of the scholar is to be, quote, one with oneself, and quote, and then help guide the, quote, advancement of the humanity and the good in society. At the time when this phrase was introduced, Korea was under the dominion of foreign forces, so historians were naturally conscious of this deteriorating situation and highly nationalistic. Also popular at the time was Fichte's addresses to the German nation because of its emphasis on the independence and also on the importance of education, among others. We can see that Fichte is regarded as historically relevant because his thoughts are for the purpose of transforming the reality, both self and the world. And it is because his philosophy answers the call of the age that his philosophy was relevant. Now in the 21st century, how do you teach Fichte to Korean students, or for that matter, any students? Teaching Fichte in English or any language presents such a difficult task. Fichte is not easy to read, even in original German, as it's not always transparent. Here, we naturally rely heavily on Dan's translations. from Fichte's early philosophical writings to the latest foundation, Daniel's translations are a massive undertaking and an event by itself. My own initial introduction to the topic in Fichte was from an academic historical textual perspective, but I got gradually strongly imbued by and under the spell of a perspective of practice, as Fichte's concern was with a transcendental perspective on the life, the very life that we live. His writings often have the impact as if it is a set of instructions for a method of self-examination together with the analytic tools that he employs. Dan is regarded by many as one of the great Fichte scholars of the 20th century. In his writings, he offered the most sophisticated and far-reaching insights about Fichte's philosophy. His translations also introduced the philosophical ideas of Fichte to the general public. University classes often find his translations very insightful and extremely useful for discussing leading ideas in Fichte, offering the most revelatory ways of interpreting the main but difficult philosophical discourses here. The instructor, or for that matter, reader, must approach Fichte as if she or he is the very one doing the philosophical experiment. In other words, the best way to teach Fichte seems to be not passively delivering or transmitting his ideas, but to become a Fichte. In this way, one becomes the philosopher, examining and evaluating one's own personal philosophical journey, while engaging the life as is juxtaposed with the necessities of dealing with the complex problems in everyday world. Here, it is an imperative to remove our self-constructed conceptual barriers between our inner experience and the outer realities, and build a way of reconciling a genuine philosophical or transcendental perspective and the ordinary secular the standpoint of life. Daniel says that his interest in Fichte was initially motivated by Bertrand Russell, when the latter made sarcastic remarks on Fichte, describing his philosophy of I as literally insane in the well-known history of Western philosophy. In this sense, Dan revolted against Russell and his view of the so-called robust sense of reality. Hegelian philosophers have often tended to dismiss Fichte as a subjective idealist, and in Russell's work, Fichte, quote, abandoned things in themselves and carried subjectivism to a kind of insanity, end of quote. I will skip several pages and move on to the last part of my draft. Fichte says in his introduction to the first Wissenschaftslehre that his philosophy is nothing other than a Kantian system. But in the process of completing his system, he simply went over Kant. The original I, as the transcendental condition of the representations accompanied by the feeling of necessity that is experience, is possible only when it is confronted by what it is not, that is, the not I. And this also gives rise to the idea of a check, Fichte calls Anstoß. The latter is Fichte's counterpart to Kant's thing in itself. However, its character is different from the Kantian thing in itself. For Kant, the I is in relation of heterogeneous affection with the thing in itself. For Fichte, this would go nowhere, as this is a kind of return to the dogmatism of Spinoza. Rather, the Fichtean Anstoß indicates something completely self-originating, the self-limitation of itself. The I then turns out to be finite at all. I don't know how many times Dan personally assured me that Fichtean I is always finite. But this is its merit because this is how the I turns out to have the character of consciousness. The Fichtean subject is not that of an abstract rational nature in general, but a concrete human subject par excellence. This picture also gives rise to a robust sense of objective reality. It is not an insane subjectivist philosophy that Fichte tried to create with a turn of a philosophical magic wand in an isolated spiritual subject. The objective world is constructed, so to speak, by way of the synthetic genetic principles of mind. The principle of the I equals I is not a mere logical totality, but rather express a process of discovering oneself. And the I is not only an activity, but a goal-oriented one, whose goal is nothing other than itself. So the finite I turns out to be a self-consciousness that calls out to others of the same type. After all, we recognize each other as belonging to one and the same species. The world that Fichte speaks of must then be a social world. Fichte's contribution to philosophy, with his theory of self-consciousness, the view that the I's self-positing immediately invites others to exist, has been touted as the original insight in Fichte by Heinrich and others following him. At this point, we may say that the history of Western philosophy may be conveniently divided into three periods. The philosophy of being dominate the ancient and medieval periods. Then, with the cogito in Descartes, the philosophy of consciousness dominated modern philosophy, which sort of culminated in Kant. I think philosophy of consciousness or subjectivity is followed by a philosophy of the other or alterity. Despite Fichte's moniker as the philosopher of the I or ecologist, despite his claim that he merely tried to continue the Kantian trends of philosophy, I believe that he is the one who actually opened a new era in philosophy, the era of alterity. In his view, subjectivity naturally leads to objectivity. The I is not without the other and vice versa. Further, this I stands in need of embodiment. We are who we are, not as Cartesian egos, but as embodied and finite I's. This is the finite human rationality that Dan always emphasized in his lectures, translations, and writings. Fichte invites us all to reignite the passion for a reflection on the subjectivity. What does it mean to be a human subject in the 21st century, the era of AI and the fourth industrial revolution? The basic and the very simple idea, as we will see, is that the human being is first and foremost not an isolated subject cut off from a realm of object that it wishes to know about. We are rather beings who are always already in the world, outside and alongside the world with which, for the most part, we easily mingle. The world that Fichte believed in is a world in which the finite embodied consciousnesses interact with each other. This is not the world of things in themselves, no world of dead matters, but a social world par excellence, where we engage in our usual activities in our interactions, sometimes in conflict, of course, but sometimes in cooperation. The history is open, and it's our vocation to realize a freedom in history in its full-fledged sense. This is where Bildung comes in and can do a heavy lifting. The scholar that Fichte frequently refers to turns out to be the one armed with this very Bildung, and it is our vocation as well. We owe a lot to Daniel for the rediscovery and access to Fichte thought, especially with its historical sense of reality through his translations and writings. But the translations did not come out of the vacuum. Dan always appreciated the whole transcendental traditions, as well as the ordinary people around him, including his family and friends. Outstanding scholar and an outstanding human being. The heart and the soul always went hand in hand with Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hala, for this great talk. And now the floor is open for questions, and I see that Anthony has a question.
Hala, to touch on something briefly that you mentioned, I believe you said that high school students in South Korea are familiar with the opposition between the I and the not I. If that's right, could you just say a bit? I mean, that's tantalizing. Are they made to read Fichte, and do they apply Fichtean theory to the experience of young people relating to each other as I's? I'm fascinated.
Thank you for the question, Anthony. Good to meet you. No, the textbook does not mention Fichte. Unfortunately, the historian who refers to the conflict between or struggle between the I and the not I, introduced this idea to describe historical processes as a struggle between the I and the not I. The I, here in this context, referring to the Korean nation, and the not I describing the foreign invader. So that's the context, the nationalist historian perspective. Unfortunately, Fichte was not mentioned. I am pretty sure that he didn't command good. He didn't have a good command of foreign languages as well. So
I see. Thank you.
Okay, I think Karl has a question.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me?
yes, I
It's
got
great to
Karl.
see you. You know, we go back a long way, Hala, so it's wonderful. I just want to use this opportunity to ask you a kind of odd question. You know, you were talking about the, as was just mentioned, the text and being over there now. You know, the notion of consciousness and the I comes into what we call Western philosophy surprisingly late. You know, it's also like an invention. So I've had some friends, you know, they say, well, maybe, you know, in other parts of the world, maybe the Asian world or who knows where else, you know, it's not clear that there's any tradition there where the notion of consciousness or focus on the I, you know, is really central as it is in our Cartesian tradition. But I've never known whether that's kind of a stereotype or a mistake. So since you know, have a much more cosmopolitan perspective, would you say if you're teaching over there, say in Korea or something like that, that of course now everybody's so cosmopolitan, but you know, does the notion of the I or focusing on consciousness, as Dan did and as Reinhold did and as you know, so-called Cartesians, does it strike people as odd, or is it just like, oh yeah, we can do that? I mean, there's some people, even, you know, physicalists today, who think consciousness is a myth, but do you feel there's any difference when you're talking in a, say, as you often did in North America, or as opposed to in Asia?
Thanks for a great question. Yes, Asian languages, Korean in particular, has a term for I, but it doesn't carry the connotation of a Cartesian ego for sure. And Cartesian substance is a foreign notion to us. To tell the truth, the very idea of freedom had to be invented and introduced to East Asia. It didn't exist until late 18th or early 19th century. It's a Western notion. When the Commodore Perry arrived in Japan, they had them sign a treaty where the Commodore introduced the idea of freedom of religion, and people were completely perplexed as to exactly what they're talking about. I mean, this guys with strange guys with a black ship asking for a freedom of religion, and that didn't have any notion of freedom and nor religion as well. So it's something that was foreign to us, and then we had to invent this notion. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So the existing notion of, in fact, the traditional notion of the human body shows a conspicuous lack of the existing brain. To tell the truth, people used to, I mean, people in East Asia thought that we didn't think with our brain, but we must think with our heart. So heart. So the Chinese term for the mind, shin, or in Korean, shim, is now usually translated as mind/heart. That's the reason why. So there's a big conceptual discrepancy in the division between substance and properties, and the idea of archetype, Platonic idea of archetype, and the eidos versus the copy. It didn't exist. It didn't exist, and then the Asian mind seems to be more concerned with the idea of complementarity. I mean, yin and yang, and also what they call the T and Yung. We think that there's nothing permanent separation between separation between the entity and its property. It's all interact with each other. It's more like a process. So Fichtian idea of activity might be more congenial as opposed to the isolated substantial view emphasized by Descartes or others. So that's my take on that. Thanks for a great question.
Thank you so much, Hala, and thank you so much for your talk and discussion. And now we'll move on to the Q&A part of the session. So the floor is now open for questions for any of the speakers, or also for comments on Dan's legacy. If you want to jump in and say something about this, feel free. So please use the raise hand function or make me a sign, and I'll give you the floor. Gabe.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a question about fictions for Corinne. In part, this is just this question for my own sort of purposes and understanding of what's going on in the foundations of natural right. But there he uses that, as you mentioned in your talk, this concept of a fiction in reference to original right. And original right, as Fichte employs the concept, is itself already kind of a strange notion, though figures at the time are using this kind of terminology. But to call it a fiction, it plays such an important role in the system, it seems strange to refer to it as a fiction, though he certainly has in mind this idea, which I didn't hear as strongly emphasized in your remarks, that the fictions are necessary, right? They play some fundamental necessary role. It's not as if we could do without them, though nevertheless, they are fictions, which is a tension already. And maybe you did mention this and I missed it, but is a tension already. But so one of the things, though, I'm just wondering about in general, though, about that use of fiction is if it might have some connection, or if you think it might have some connection with the role of the state of nature as a kind of fiction, and the way that concept operates often in political philosophy as a fiction we posit for explanatory or reasons.
Yeah, great question, Gabe. So this is something that I'm very interested in. As I mentioned, I'm thinking about this also in kind of the contemporary context. So in the foundations of natural right, as you know, Fichte seems to think that all rights are conventional. And so it seems like really there is no such thing as a right that we would have in a state of nature outside of community. And nonetheless, it's interesting that he thinks that we have to posit something like the state of nature or the idea of an original right as a kind of fiction for the sake of a science of right. And I've been trying to understand exactly how to think about that tension. And so it's interesting, actually, in this grad seminar that I'm teaching on human dignity, we read one paper by Simmons, who is responding to Waldron's idea that dignity just plays this kind of organizing concept. The dignity is sort of like a status in the same way that, being bankrupt or being an infant is a status, and then you can spell out what that status means. And so dignity is a status, and then the rights at a company spell out what that status of having dignity is. And Simmons sort of responds to that and says, well, I mean, that seems not to kind of capture the kind of exigent grip of the idea that dignity gives rise to this sort of duty of respect that is categorical, that is inalienable, no? And so he says, it's kind of useful to think of bring in the kind of theory of natural right and the idea of a state of nature to sort of help us kind of hold on to that idea of inalienable rights, even if we think that in some sense all rights are kind of conventional. So I think maybe there's something like that going on in Fichte, that even though he thinks that all rights are conventional and that we have no rights outside of community, that in order to sort of preserve something like the exigent grip of the respect that we have for other people, that we need to posit something like the idea of an original right as a kind of fiction. But I think it's really, really fascinating to see, people now writing about rights, struggling with exactly the same sort of tensions.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Great. Further questions? Do any of the speakers or comments? Gabe.
So I had a question for Hala, and this is sort of following up on Anthony's question. So I get that Fichte is not mentioned in this text, and students aren't studying Fichte, though Hegel did teach, as I'm sure many of you know, the phenomenology of spirit to some high school students. So clearly high school students are ready for this kind of material. But I'm just wondering, it sounds much more like the addresses, the kind of view that, and this is, I think, like the point that you're making, this kind of nationalistic element. And I'm just kind of curious, like, is there a reception of the addresses? And is there a reception of the addresses in Korea or in Asia? And if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh, it was very well received, and then there is a work entitled "Addresses to the Korean Nation" as well. Apparently, a variation on a Fichtean theme, So national independence and the mandatory education, and especially the idea of the Bildung played a large role in the process of modernization in Korea. I bet it's the same with Japan and China as well. But you can deny that Hegel played a more conspicuous role, to tell the truth. Tom Rockmore tells me that when he taught at Beijing, they acted as if they knew about Hegel more than he did, or for that matter, Marx. So they had a very well-trenched tradition in the Hegel studies and Marx studies. But I was really surprised to find that the Chinese audience were not receptive to my lecture on Fichte when I gave a talk there. So Fichte was a relatively new phenomenon. So I think that's generally the case with China and Korea, but maybe exception may be made in Japan, because the founding father of modern Japanese philosopher, the Nishida, the founder of Kyoto School, his second book was taken from the idea from Fichte, especially the idea of Tathandlung, and he transformed it into what he calls a pure experience as the original source of the world, even the pre-subject and pre-object idea, kind of subject and object. So that's the idea that has been transplanted into Japanese philosophical stage, and that combined nicely with the Japanese idea of Zen, the philosophy of nothingness. So that much I can say. Thanks for the question.
There is also, I think, in Japan, a complete translation of Fichte's works, like much more extensive, I think, than the translations of his works. in English.
There's no question about that. And then they even translated Site well before it was translated to English as well. So you can tell a lot about their the interest in that aspect of European philosophy.
Thanks.
Very nice.
Thanks.
Good. Yaisha?
I wanted to ask another question about the fictions discussion. As you know, Karin, I'm interested in this too. So I was wondering, like, when you went through Dan Breazeale's writings again, and you went through the writings on Maimon and Fichte, did you find that there's an interesting difference somewhere between the ways in which they use the concept of fiction? Or do you think it's essentially the same idea? You're muted.
Sorry. So the thing that struck me this time that I was kind of reviewing that literature, and of course I know that you've worked on this. I'm looking forward to talking about it with you soon. It seems like the main difference between the way that Maimon uses a notion of fictions and the way that Fichte does. You know, they both think that fictions have an important role in bringing systematic unity among our claims to knowledge, but that Maimon seems committed to the idea that fictions are limited to that kind of role of bringing about systematic unity, that they can't also help to kind of generate new knowledge. Whereas Fichte does seem to be kind of committed to that, right? That, you know, you posit the absolute I and then you derive all of experience from that and all of the transcendental conditions of experience. So it seems like that's the main difference. But, you know, it's interesting. I was wondering about, you know, I was thinking about whether one could even push back against Maimon's claim that creating systematic unity doesn't also kind of generate new knowledge. You know, so I was thinking about this. For example, this might seem like an odd connection, but I was thinking about it in connection with debates about internalism in reasons. You know, so there are a lot of people writing in ethics about the idea that we only really have a reason to do something if it connects with a desire that we already have, right? That we have no reason to do anything unless it somehow connects with a desire that we already have. Many people who defend that view are some sort of subjectivists about reasons. And yet, you know, many of them seem to say that, you know, you can, you know, somebody can kind of point out to you how doing something or having a reason might be kind of implicitly connected with a reason that you already have, although you might not be aware of that yet. No, and so by kind of showing the connection between this other thing that you should do and a desire that you already have, you actually do come to have new reasons. So that's one way in which I was thinking about how generating systematic unity could actually result in new knowledge, you know, by sort of showing how things are implicitly connected to things that you're already committed to. You actually should be committed to these other things. So it's a kind of transcendental argument, I guess, where you're showing, well, you might not be aware of a commitment that you already have, but I'm trying to sort of make you aware of that by showing the kind of connections between your thought. So that's something that I'm interested in, you know, whether one could push back against Maimon's claim that generated systematic unity doesn't create new knowledge.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks.
I actually have a question. You know, I know that there are a number of people here who haven't spoken, and I'm curious, you know, whether you would like to share something about in what context you knew Dan, or how Dan has influenced your work, or one of your favorite essays that Dan wrote. So I would love to hear from other people here, if you'd like to share something about your connection to Dan or to Dan's work.
Feel free to use the raise hand function in order to share something if you would like to. I saw that Hala wanted to say something. You raised your hand, right, Hala?
That's correct, but I'll ask it later after we fill the questions about this Dan's legacy.
No, feel free to do it now. People will raise their hands, and I will follow the order, so it will be fine. Go ahead. Are
you sure? I was gonna ask John about the place of Reinhold in the development of Fichte's own philosophy in response to Demus Schutze as well. I always thought that Reinhold believed in the thing in itself, as he was as he regarded himself as a follower of Kant, and probably the first one to teach Kant in an academic institution in Germany. But apparently Kant thought that the phenomenal objects stand in a kind of a hetero-affective relation with the thing in itself, whereas Fichte thinks that it's a homogeneous or auto-affective relation. If I may borrow Zahavi's term, I was wondering if Reinhold held a view about the relation between a phenomenal object and on the one hand and the thing itself on the other. That's my question, John.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yes, so Reinhold does endorse the doctrine of the thing in itself. As for Reinhold's influence on Fichte and the development of the Wissenschaftslehre, the 2016 essay that I mentioned, where Dan reevaluates the literature since his 1981 article, contains, I think, his most recent thoughts on that topic and the Demus review and the constellation of issues surrounded with Reinhold, Schulze, and Fichte. And I can't rehearse the details of the article at the moment, but I recall that he strongly endorses a view espoused by James Messina. So actually, in an unpublished version of the paper, which Dan had sent me previously, he cites Messina's paper as the occasion for his own reevaluation of the issues. So yeah, for I guess a more detailed look at Dan's thoughts on that issue, I might direct you to that paper. And as for a final thought on the thing in itself, Reinhold then actually endorsed Fichte's own position in 1797, and he cites the thing in itself, or the fact that his previous position entails a commitment to the thing in itself as one of the reasons for his renunciation of the elementary philosophy and his alleged endorsement of the Wissenschaftslehre. But as Dan and several other scholars have pointed out, there seems to be difficulties in reconciling Reinhold's interpretation of the Wissenschaftslehre with Fichte's own view. So most people think that Reinhold's commitment to the Wissenschaftslehre was weak at best or confused.
That helps. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Karin.
Okay, so I'm not at all a specialist of Reinhold, but I'd like to say something in his defense. Because I think that Reinhold's early work has not been treated fairly. So there are issues, of course, with his way of developing his views and the quasi-Wolffian way of presentation. But it seems to me that his principle of consciousness was very insightful and also very influential. So maybe Reinhold had things to say about things in themselves, but I think if you focus on his notion of the principle of consciousness, you see that it is his attempt to think about the very act by means of which the distinction between the subject and object is produced. Yes, because he basically starts from the representation and then asks the question, what does it mean to somehow process this representation, which is a starting point? And what the answer is to this question is that somehow, for instance, in making a judgment, we attribute the content of the representation to something over against ourselves. But in this very activity, we at the same time also identify as the source of the activity. So maybe this is not exactly the way in which he puts it, and he was attacked for his specific way of putting it. But I think that if you abstract a little bit from the way he puts it, then you see that it is about the very activity that produces the distinction between the subject and the object. And it seems to me that Fichte must have seen this, and maybe did not sufficiently acknowledge his debt to Reinhold in this regard. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to add to the conversation.
Good. Gabe, you want to say something about this?
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think I'll just speak on the Fichtean point, though. I think one of the things so Fichte is incredibly indebted to that insight that Reinhold has. And he takes issue in part methodologically with how Reinhold arrives at that conclusion. But that point aside, he thinks that basically that principle is the foundational principle of theoretical knowledge. And so in some way, one way of kind of reconstructing the Grundlage is to see the deduction of representation, which is like sort of the final part of the second part of the text before he transitions into the practical, is to see that in part as an attempt to provide a proper foundation for this Reinholdian principle of consciousness, though it runs into some of its own sort of difficulties that requires a further justification from a practical side. And that's where there's kind of methodological differences, I think, in part between Reinhold and Fichte. But I do think that that's like an insight that Fichte, at least in the Jena period, is endorsing, and then in some ways trying to work out and maybe even overcome in some ways, but essential.
Very nice. Other questions or comments? Karen?
Unfortunately, Luis, I have to sign off. But I wanted to thank you and thank Karen so much for organizing this and for the invitation. I hope, Karen, we will meet in person soon. We've met virtually a few times, but I hope we'll be able to meet in person again soon. And very good to see everybody. Karl, Gabe, Anthony, lovely to see you again.
So before you go, Karen, I just would like to ask everyone to join me in thanking all of you for being here today for this wonderful session of the Leuven seminar. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it was a very productive session, and we are all very happy to be here today and to share this moment. So thank you so much.
Daniel, also good to see you.
Yeah, hello. Great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think we could move on to the informal part of our meeting. You're all, please stay online. You're all